Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive here on Occult Archives. We do it here, cracking open those intriguing and sometimes feared books of history.
That's right, peeling back those layers of mystery.
Exactly. And this time, well, this one's special. We're taking a deep dive into a work that's less about grimoires and spells and more about, well, mapping the divine. It's called The Anatomy of the Body of God by Frater Achad, published in 1925. And believe me, it's a wild ride through the Qabalistic Tree of Life like you've probably never encountered.
It's definitely a Cad's own personal vision. We're working directly with his book for this deep dive, so we're getting his unfiltered revelations and interpretations of the Tree of Life.
So today, our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to really get to grips with a few of Achad's big ideas here. First, we're talking about his claim that the Tree of Life isn't just, a static diagram, but a living, dynamic, constantly expanding structure. Then we'll dig into the geometric nuts and bolts, the Vesica Piscis and all that, and how Achad sees the tree as the body of God. And of course, we'll touch upon how all of this connects to, the universe at large and also to us as individuals. Oh, and we can't forget Achad's pretty unique take on the arrangement of those paths on the Tree of Life. He definitely ruffled some feathers with those.
He did. Right from the start, Achad makes it clear that this is, well, deeply personal for him. He talks about having this incredible revelation back on April 14th, 1923, just after finishing his work on the Egyptian revival.
He says in that moment, he perceived the Tree of Life, the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, as the variable anatomy of Ra-Hoor-Khuit. Now remember, for Achad, Ra-Hoor-Khuit is essentially the ever-coming sun, that dynamic force between Nuit and Hadit, the two infinites.
It's not just an abstract concept for him. He really experiences this as a profound revelation that kicks off his entire exploration.
Absolutely. So from there, Achad really starts digging into those foundational Kabbalistic concepts. He's talking about the Ein, the absolute nothingness, the void beyond any conception. And then you have Ein Sof, which is the limitless space that, that kind of defines the Ein itself. It's like the pure potential for anything and everything to exist. And then emanating from Ein Sof, we get Ein Sof R, which is the limitless light, the first kind of stirring, the first hint of manifestation within that boundless space.
These are some seriously mind-bending ideas trying to wrap your head around absolute nothingness and limitless space.
No kidding. But then Achad explains how he sees this limitless light coalescing, concentrating, and forming Kether.
And for context, Kether is that very first sephira on the tree, the first point of emanation, the first positive idea, as Achad calls it. And it's often associated with the number one, that initial spark of creation.
Right. And Achad really emphasizes how he sees Kether as the junction, the meeting point of those two infinites. But he's very specific about it being the concentration of that light towards the infinitely small.
Towards the Ein itself, almost like a reversal of the typical emanation model.
Exactly. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have Malkuth, the 10th Sephira, what we experience as the material world, the physical realm. But Achad doesn't see it as some kind of static endpoint. He presents it as the ever-expanding substance, filling that limitless space of Ein Sof. So you have this incredible dynamic tension between Kether with its infinite contraction towards the Ein and Malkuth with its infinite expansion out into Ein Sof.
It's a constant interplay between these two fundamental forces, this cosmic breathing in and out.
I like that, a cosmic breath. And Achad really sees the entire universe as the consequence of one thought that unfolds according to these principles of pure reason. And the Tree of Life for him is like the map of that unfolding.
Every single sephira, every path, has its designated place in that grand scheme, representing how that one life force is interacting with and manifesting within that one substance.
It's pretty heady stuff. Now, here's where things start to get a little controversial. Ticket. He doesn't shy away from challenging some of the established views on the Tree of Life.
He even throws in this rather pointed analogy, quoting a passage from Book 4, Part 3. The passage argues that saying the Tree of Life is the framework of the universe is as simplistic as, saying a cat is nothing more than the letters C-A-T arranged in that order.
It's like they're saying the map isn't the territory, right?
Exactly. But while Achad acknowledges that perspective, he ultimately disagrees. He argues that the tree is actually much more than just a symbolic representation. He believes it's a fundamental design underlying the entire cosmos.
And to back up his argument, he brings up a really interesting point. He points out that if you look at all the different Qabalistic diagrams that have been floating around throughout history, Westcott, Mathers, even Crowley's own version in 777 Waits, they all have different proportions for the tree.
And this really bothered him. He felt this lack of uniformity was a problem, especially when you consider the Sefer Yetzirah. Remember, that ancient text explicitly instructs us to fix the design in its purity and to restore the device or workmanship to its place.
So for Achad, it's not just about aesthetics or personal preference, it's about uncovering the true underlying structure of the tree, the blueprint, if you will, that was intended all along.
And in his search for that pure design, Achad arrives at a really intriguing conclusion. He becomes convinced that the foundation of the Tree of Life is, well, geometry. And not even complicated geometry. He's talking about the absolute basics. The point, the line, the circle, the triangle, those right-angled figures. Almost like the divine architect used these simple tools to build the whole thing.
Achad describes this very specific method using 4 intersecting circles drawn on a vertical line to determine the exact placement of the Sephiroth, resulting in what he believes is, well, a perfectly proportioned and harmonious tree. He even credits a fellow seeker, Frater Achad, for first pointing him towards this method.
But the really important piece here is how Akkad emphasizes the role of the Vesica Piscis.
Now, for those who might not be familiar, the Vesica Piscis is that almond or lens shape you get when you have 2 circles of the same radius intersecting in a specific way. Each circle's circumference passes through the center of the other circle.
Akkad even quotes Sidney T. Klein on this, talking about the curious and marvelous properties of the Vesica Piscis and its long history in sacred geometry, architecture, all sorts of things.
It pops up everywhere, and Achad realizes that the Qabalistic Tree of Life, that ancient diagram, isn't just some arbitrary design. It's actually built on the same fundamental geometric principle, the Vesica Piscis.
But then he takes it even further. Because the Vesica Piscis can be generated and expanded infinitely, just keep drawing those intersecting circles, Akkad realizes that the Tree of Life, by extension, is not a static, fixed diagram. It's capable of, well, of infinite expansion.
That's where his concept of the living tree comes in, a tree with roots stretching down into the infinitely small, maybe even into the Ain itself, and branches reaching out into the vastness of the cosmos.
It suggests that the universe itself is not static and fixed, but constantly growing and evolving, and so too must our understanding of it. And that's where the Tree of Life comes in, as a kind of dynamic map.
A map that can grow and change along with the territory, right?
Exactly. From there, Akkad turns his attention to a theme that he sees recurring across different traditions, the idea of 3 in 1.
He brings up examples from, well, from everywhere. Hermetic teachings, the alchemical trinity, the Qabalah's own mother letters, the Trimurti in Hinduism, even the Holy Trinity in Christianity.
It's a surprisingly consistent motif across these seemingly disparate systems.
It does make you wonder if there's something to it, some underlying pattern in human thought.
Achad definitely thinks so. And he points out how this 3 in 1 often finds its resolution or manifestation in a 4th element.
Think of it like the 3 sides of a triangle coming together to form a shape, or the Hebrew letters IHV becoming IHVH with the addition of that final he representing manifestation.
He then connects this idea to the 10 Sephiroth on the Tree of Life and the symbolic significance of the number 10, which often represents a kind of return to unity after a cycle of differentiation. He even brings up that famous opening line from the Sefer Yetzirah, the 2 and 30 most occult and wonderful paths of wisdom created by the divine, using 3 Sephirim, number writing, and speech, and the 10 numbers of the Sephiroth.
Lots of numbers flying around there.
Right. Now, what about death? We can't really talk about the Tree of Life without mentioning death. That's sometimes 11th Sephira that seems to be, well, kind of hidden or implied.
Yeah, it's always a bit mysterious.
Well, Akkad clarifies his position on death, explaining that he doesn't see it as a separate Sephira with its own paths. Instead, he sees it as a realm of higher knowledge, something that's not localized to one point, but is drawn from the entirety of the tree itself.
It's like an emergent property of the whole system rather than a specific piece of it.
Exactly. He also points out that there aren't any direct paths on the standard tree diagram that would form a perfect upright pentagram, which represents the microcosm united with a hexagram, which represents the macrocosm.
That's a really interesting observation.
Akkad sees this as significant, implying that the unification of the microcosm and macrocosm, that's the great work for us as humans to undertake and discover. It's about bridging that gap between the individual and the cosmic, the inner and the outer.
And then Achad, ever the geometrician, dives into all those perfect geometric shapes he sees embedded within his proportionally correct tree. We're talking hexagons, triangles, rectangles, diamonds, all following those Vesica Piscis proportions. He also points out the overarching proportional relationships of the whole tree, like how the height from Malkuth to Kether is equal to the width of 4 Vesicae.
He's really meticulously analyzing every detail here. And then he drops this pretty amazing observation. The first 9 Sephiroth, from Kether down to Yesod, they form a perfect Vesica Piscis when you draw the tree with the correct proportions. Kether at the top, Yesod where the 2 arcs intersect at the bottom.
That's a powerful visual.
It is. And then he connects this Vesica to Adam, whose numeration in Hebrew is 45, which is the sum of the numbers 1 through 9, all those Sephiroth within the Vesica. And then he does the same for Eve, Chava, whose numeration is 19, which he derives from those specific lines within the Vesica that connect Sephiroth 1, 4, 5, and 9. It's like he's showing this fundamental union of masculine and feminine principles contained within this basic geometric shape.
And then what about Malkuth, sitting below this Vesica?
Well, Achad links Malkuth to the Qabalistic concept of the world of shells, the Qlipoth and the unredeemed daughter. It's a symbolic representation of that potential for separation that exists in the material world.
It's outside that primordial unity of the Vesica, but still part of the whole structure.
Exactly. And Achad goes on to suggest that the true proportion of the tree isn't just a single Vesica, but actually the intersection of 2 Vesicae, one nested within the other. This creates a more complex geometric figure.
More layers.
Exactly. And within this double Vesica, Achad finds a visual representation of the Tetragrammaton, the divine name IHVH.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, he sees the vertical line of the middle pillar as representing the father, the horizontal axis through Tiferet as the son, the upper Vesica as the mother, and the lower Vesica as the daughter. It's a really elegant way to represent those 4 aspects of the divine.
And all within the geometry of those intersecting circles?
Absolutely. From there, Achad shifts his focus to those 2 and 30 paths of wisdom mentioned in the Sefer Yetzirah. He really goes deep on those, exploring all their numerical and symbolic correspondences.
So, he connects the number 2 with the Hebrew letter Beth, which is associated with Mercury, wisdom, the magician. 30 he links to Lamed, the ox goad, Libra, justice. He even breaks down the words BL for Lord and LB for mind or heart and how they relate to wisdom and will.
And then he looks at that total number, 32, which is the number of paths plus the Sephiroth. He connects that to AHIH, the name of God associated with Kether, and IHVH, which governs the other 9 Sephiroth.
And he kind of combines them, right, into AHIHVH.
He does. He sees it as the complete name encompassing the entire tree. And then he offers this interesting interpretation of IAH, Yod-He. He sees it as a kind of monogram of the eternal. The Yod represents the father and the element of fire. He represents the mother and water, and together they conceal the sun, represented by Aleph and Air. He then connects this triadic formula to those tools of creation mentioned in the Sefer Yetzirah: number, writing, and speech.
Really laying that symbolic foundation.
He is. And he goes on to explain the significance of numbers 10, 20, and 22, and those fundamental categories of the Hebrew alphabet, the 3 mother letters, 7 double letters, and 12 simple letters, which correspond to the elements, planets, and zodiac signs.
Those are like the building blocks of all the universal ideas, right?
Exactly. Now, we've got to talk about one of the more controversial aspects of Achad's work, his revision of the paths on the Tree of Life. He was convinced that for centuries, Kabbalists had been working with a system that was, well, out of whack. He felt it didn't have that perfect harmony.
Yeah, he really shook things up with that.
He did. He actually refers back to his earlier works, QBL and the Egyptian Revival, where he first presented his new revised arrangement.
So what's different about his arrangement?
Well, for one, he rearranges the middle pillar paths so they visually resemble the caduceus of Mercury. Those are the paths associated with the 3 mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin.
Okay.
And then he reassigns the planetary letters to their corresponding Sephiroth, with a specific placement for Jupiter, which represents Kether and the Wheel of Life.
And what about the zodiacal letters?
Those he unites with the Sephira, ruled by their corresponding planet. He felt this created a much more direct and logical connection.
So it wasn't just a random rearrangement. He had a whole system behind it.
Absolutely. He believed this revised system was actually revealing a lost tradition, a more accurate and harmonious way of understanding the tree. He even suggests that it represents a reconciliation of the snake and the sword at the Gate of Eden, hinting at a path back to that original state of unity and wisdom.
Fascinating. Now, this whole idea of a revised tree becomes even more significant when we get to Achad's concept of the tree as a dynamic, progressing structure. He talks about meditating on the sun and its central role, and how this led him to imagine direct rays of influence connecting the sun to the Sephiroth, kind of ignoring the usual paths and supporting scriptures for a
It
moment.
was a thought experiment, really.
And it sparked this amazing idea. He starts to see the tree not as a single static structure, but as something that could divide and multiply. Imagine smaller trees being generated within larger trees, infinitely, both outward towards the infinitely great and inward towards the infinitely small.
Like a cosmic fractal.
Exactly. And this
Hmm.
ties back to that idea of Ra-Hoor-Khuit, the ever-coming sun, that constant renewal. With this image in mind, Achad starts to question those traditional ideas of influences flowing upwards and downwards on the tree. He suggests we need to start from a central point, which he identifies as Hadit in Melkuth, the very core of our individual experience, and then see the tree as expanding outwards in all directions from that point.
It's a shift in perspective, really. He even outlines how an individual's journey through the paths of the tree would be affected by this expansion. He talks about encountering these second and third trees and receiving additional influxes of power and understanding from them.
He also notes that Melkuth's diameter doubles at certain points of attainment on the middle pillar, marking these significant thresholds in that expansion. And he even suggests that those four untraveled trees between each contacted Kether might represent the four worlds of the Qabalah.
Atziluth, Braya, Yetzirah, and Asaya.
Right. And then he even maps out how certain Sephiroth from one tree end up aligning with specific paths on the next larger tree. It's all incredibly intricate and interconnected.
It is. And then Akari takes things, well, into another dimension. He proposes that the Tree of Life isn't just a flat two-dimensional diagram. He says it's actually the front surface of a triangular crystal prism.
Okay, now that's a mind bender. So the tree has depth.
It does, in Achad's vision. He sees the central pillar as the core of this prism, Kether at the apex forming a pyramid, and Malkuth as the lower point of a tetrahedron at the base.
So where do the paths fit into all of this?
Well, he explains that many of the paths we see on the usual diagram aren't actually on that front surface of the prism. They recede back into that hidden third angle. So there are actually three reciprocal paths of each kind, plus those additional vertical paths within the structure.
The two-dimensional tree is just a partial representation of a much more complex form.
Exactly. He even describes the experience of viewing Kether from above, seeing a triangular figure with three spheres, each one embodying both Chokmah and Vina simultaneously, and six paths, each one associated with Sadi, Aquarius, and the star.
It's like that three-dimensional view starts to break down some of the dualities and oppositions we might perceive in the flat diagram.
It does. He talks about how looking at this twisted prism from different angles can reveal the triplicity, yet unity, of those seemingly opposing paths, like Rishayan, the sun, and the devil.
Those are pretty opposite concepts.
They are. But in the three-dimensional structure, they're shown to be interconnected, just different aspects of the same thing. He even describes taking theoretical cross-sections of this prism at different levels, each one revealing those underlying triplicities of Sephiroth and paths.
It's like slicing through the tree at different energetic layers.
Right. So Achad's complete prismatic tree, as he calls it, contains 13 spheres and 36 paths, which adds up to 49, reducing to 13. He even gives us this sense of an astral journey through this triple tree, experiencing the blending of influences and that ever-expanding triangular consciousness.
Intense stuff.
It is. And just like the two-dimensional tree, this prismatic tree can also expand and contract infinitely from that central point in Malkuth.
Malkuth as that central point of individual experience.
Right, and the central axis, Malkuth, Yesod, Tifrith, Kether, those stay connected through all of those progressions, unified by those three mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin.
So there's a stable core that runs through all of those transformations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Achad then takes it even further and starts combining these trees into larger formations.
Okay, this is where my brain might start to melt.
I know, right? But it's fascinating. He finds that if you combine 6 of those flat two-dimensional trees, they naturally form a hexagonal six-pointed star. And he equates this configuration with the macrocosm. He even compares it to a snowflake crystallizing from water under the influence of spirit.
Beautiful imagery.
It is. But when he combines the solid prismatic trees, they don't form a six-pointed star. They come together to form a perfect pentagon.
And that he identifies with.
The microcosm, the realm of the individual, with Malkuth at the center and the lines of the pentagon representing the paths associated with Taurus and the Hierophant.
So the six-pointed star for the macrocosm, the pentagon for the microcosm.
Exactly. And this all leads up to his final, most complex structure. 4 blocks of 5 of these prismatic trees combine to form a solid that can expand in all directions, filling every dimension. And this structure takes the form of...
Let me guess. A dodecahedron.
You got it. A perfect 12-sided dodecahedron, those pentagonal faces, the whole deal. And this, for Achad, is the anatomy of the body of God, the fundamental structure of matter under the influence of spirit.
Wow. He calculates the total number of Sephiroth and paths in this whole structure to be 775, which reduces to 10.
And the 20 kethers form 12 regular pentagons that touch that circumscribing sphere at 80 points. It's an incredible vision of cosmic geometry.
And naturally, Achad ties this all back to, the OG geometrician, Plato. He brings up that idea of geometry as the knowledge of the eternal, and that principle that God is always geometrizing.
Creating through geometry, building the universe with numbers and shapes.
And of course, he mentions Plato's description of the universe as a dodecahedron in the Timaeus.
He even cites Proclus and Thomas Taylor, who interpret that myth of Vulcan forging those 20 tripods as a reference to the 20 solid angles of the dodecahedron.
And we can't forget Madame Blavatsky. Achad quotes her Secret Doctrine, where she talks about the cosmos being built on that dodecahedron, originating from divine thought.
He's bringing in all the heavy hitters here.
He is. And then, of course, he connects it all to Plato's 3 fundamental natures. What is generated? The world. That in which generation takes place, space, and that of which the world is an image, cosmic reason.
It's all interconnected, the physical world, the space it exists in, and the underlying principles that govern it.
And then Achad digs into that Platonic idea of assigning the solids to the elements. The pyramid to fire, the octahedron to air, icosahedron to water, the cube to earth, and then, of course, the dodecahedron to the universe itself.
A perfect fit for his anatomy of the body of God.
Totally. And then he dives into the numerology of it all. The simple 2-dimensional tree with its 10 Sephiroth and 22 paths, totaling 32. Then he tracks how those numbers increase with each progression of the tree, the 6-fold star, the prismatic solid.
And he always points out how those totals often reduce back down to those significant Qabalistic numbers, 10, 13.
Showing that underlying unity through all that complexity. And he reminds us of the Sefer Yetzirah and its focus on 10 Sephiroth, while also acknowledging those 3 veils above Kether, bringing the total to 13. It's like he's showing how both 10 and 13 are woven throughout these expanding structures.
It's like a hidden code.
Totally. And then we get to those proportions, which are so crucial for a shit. He reminds us of that ideal ratio for the Sephiroth, diameter 1/4 the size of the generating circles, path width half the radius of the Sephira, and then he gets back into those Vesica Piscis proportions, that ratio 15 to 26, and its connection to those divine names IA and IHVH.
He even suggests there are further proportions within that series, 30 to 52, 60 to 104, and so on.
And the overall proportions of the entire tree in his model are 26 to 60, simplifying to 13 to 30, representing that link between unity, love, and balance.
And then he reveals what he considers a crucial proportion for the supernal triad, those 3 highest Sephiroth within that solid dodecahedron. That ratio is 13 to 31, which also gives you the 108-degree angle of those pentagonal faces.
And remember, at the 5th progression of Malkuth's expansion, it encompasses that first Kether, when the whole structure has 961 Sephiroth, which is 31 times 31.
And then he connects that proportion, 208 to 496, the 5th progression of 13 to 31, with the length of the Vesica and the numeration of Malkuth.
Achad loves finding those correspondences.
He does. He even points out how other numbers pop up in these progressions, like 913 for Bereshith, 961 for Malkuth looking back up to Kether. It's all interconnected.
Absolutely. And then finally, we get to Achad's call to action, his message to the world.
He appeals to architects, urging them to use his plan to build a new universal temple, one that reflects those cosmic principles he's unveiled. He calls on religious leaders to embrace a universal teaching that aligns with science and the shared human experience.
And he asks those in authority to adopt a universal plan for governance based on the fundamental laws of the universe.
And finally, he appeals to all thinking people to purify their minds, to cultivate disciplined thought, to really try and grasp these deeper realities. It's a vision for personal and societal transformation.
So there you have it, folks. Frater Achad's Anatomy of the Body of God. It's a mind-blowing exploration of the Tree of Life, reimagined as a dynamic, ever-expanding structure built on those fundamental principles of geometry.
Achad's vision invites us to see ourselves and the entire universe in a new light, to understand that the microcosm truly reflects the macrocosm, and that maybe, just maybe, there's this incredibly intricate and harmonious design underlying it all.
And this has really just been a taste. We've only scratched the surface of all the layers of meaning and complexity in Achad's work. There's so much more to unpack, especially when it comes to the implications for magical practice and the deeper nuances of his revised path arrangements.
So we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe even inspired you to explore these ideas further on your own. What aspects of Achad's vision resonated with you? What questions are still lingering in your mind?
Because the quest for understanding, well, that's an ongoing deep dive. There's always more to uncover. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time on Occult Archives.